So good evening and welcome to this talk entitled Gerard Manley Hopkins, the Man, the Poet and the Jesuit, a Victorian, but one whose influence spread far beyond the century in which he was born. But let's begin with a bit of Victorian melodrama. It's an account of a shipwreck as published in the Times on the 11th of December, 1875. Strap on your life belts. After 3 a.m. on Tuesday morning, a scene of horror was witnessed. Some passengers clustered for safety within or upon the wheelhouse and on top of other slight structures on deck. Most of the crew and many of the emigrants went into the rigging, where they were safe enough as long as they could maintain their hold. But the intense cold and long exposure told the tale. The purser of the ship, though a strong man, relaxed his grip and fell into the sea. Women and children and men were one by one swept away from their shelters on the deck. 5 German nuns, whose bodies are now in the dead house here, clasped hands and were drowned together. The chief sister, a gaunt woman 6 feet high, calling out loudly and often, "Oh Christ, come quickly," till the end came. The shrieks and sobbing of women and children are described by the survivors as agonizing. One brave sailor who was safe in the rigging went down to try and save a child or woman who was drowning on deck. He was secured by a rope to the rigging, but a wave dashed him against the bulwarks, and when daylight dawned, his headless body, detained by the rope, was seen swaying to and fro with the waves. And that, of course, is what I've just read and should have shown you beforehand. This was, of course, the subject of Gerard Manley Hopkins' most famous poem, The Wreck of the Deutschland. And the lines quoted here, taken from it, can be found on this boulder, a stone outside Stratford Library in East London. It was near here that Gerard Manley Hopkins was born on the 28th of July, 1844, at 87 The Grove, a substantial 3-storey, late 18th century brick house destroyed during the Blitz. Gerard was the eldest of 9 children, with 5 brothers and 3 sisters, of whom 1 boy died in infancy. His parents were prosperous, with a cook, a housemaid, a nurse and a nursemaid, well educated and deeply religious. They were devout High Anglicans who worshipped at the Church of St. John the Evangelist, where Hopkins was baptized on the 24th of August, 1844. His father, Manley Hopkins, was the founder of a marine insurance company. The Deutschland would have been of particular interest to him, while his mother, Kate Smith Hopkins, was the daughter of a London physician who had been a friend of Keats. Manley Hopkins also wrote poetry, and Kate, his wife, was better educated than most Victorian women. 2 brothers would become professional artists. Arthur Hopkins, with whom Gerard had a close relationship throughout his life, illustrated Hardy's novel, The Return of the Native. And one musically talented sister became an Anglican nun. You may recognize the flag as the flag of Hawaii. In 1856, Hopkins' father was appointed Consular General for the Kingdom of Hawaii until it was annexed by the United States in 1898. He never went there, but his brother, Charles Gordon Hopkins, a talented linguist, had moved to Hawaii and had several important roles in government. In 1852, the family moved to 9 Oak Hill Park in Leafy Hampstead, where his father became church warden at another St. John's church. The children were in the habit of reading from the New Testament every day, a practice that Gerard Manley Hopkins continued when he went to school at nearby Highgate. So in September 1854, at the age of 10, Gerard Manley Hopkins became a boarder at the Cholmondeley Grammar School, now Highgate School, under the headship of the notorious flogging headmaster, Reverend Dr. John Bradley Dine. He would stay there as a pupil until 1862. One of Hopkins' friends was Coleridge's grandson, and another described him as full of fun, rippling over with jokes, quiet, gentle, always nice, and always doing his work well. I think he must have been a charming boy from a master's point of view, but he was completely changed by any wrong or ill treatment on their part. As well as a strong sense of justice, he also demonstrated a steely determination as when he abstained from liquid for a whole week for a bet, and only gave up the fast when his tongue went black and he collapsed at drill on the school playing field. This was a foretaste of the asceticism that would characterize his later life as a Jesuit. Despite his slight stature, he threw himself fully into the team games that played such an important part in the Victorian public school ethos of muscular Christianity. But his greatest forte was his academic ability. He won several prizes, including the School Poetry Prize for a poem he wrote about the Escorial, the royal palace in Madrid, seen here, showing a knowledge of art and architecture beyond his 15 years. One of his teachers was Sir Richard Watson Dixon, an Anglican priest, poet, and Keats enthusiast, who counted the Pre-Raphaelites Edward Burne-Jones and Dante Gabriel Rossetti as part of his circle. Hopkins would later begin a lifelong correspondence and friendship with him. Another teacher was the bullying headmaster with whom Hopkins had a fierce altercation when he was a sixth former, preparing for his Oxford entry examinations. His study room had been withdrawn for some infringement of rules. Hopkins confronted the formidable Reverend Dine, and as he wrote, "I was driven out of patience and cheeked him wildly, and he blazed into me with his riding whip." Hopkins related this incident in a letter to his friend Charles Luxmore. It is remarkable, though, for the ornate lettering, a Ruskin-esque landscape of trees and wild flowers within the letter D. Ruskin would be a big influence on Hopkins throughout his life. Hopkins was a talented artist and musician. He played the piano and would later compose music, as well as a gifted poet. At one time, he wanted to be a painter-poet like Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And here in 1863, two sketches, a self-portrait of the 19-year-old and a landscape on holiday on the Isle of Wight between school and university. In April 1863, Hopkins was awarded an exhibition for his performance in examinations and was enrolled at Oxford's most academically prestigious college, Balliol. He would take a first in honour moderations, Greek and Latin, in December 1864, and a first in greats, literae humaniores, that's ancient history and philosophy, in 1867, and he got a rare double first. He would become known as the Star of Balliol. These were some of the happiest years of his life. It was while studying for moderations that his journals became filled with word origins, language variation, the similarity of words in different languages, and sound associations. This interest in the multiple possibilities of a language would stay with him all his life, and is evident in his poetry. He was an admirer of the great Dorset dialect poet and philologist William Barnes, and would later note down the dialect uses of his fellow Jesuits for use in his verse. "Supping beer" is one he noted that I recognised from my own Lancashire youth. Like Barnes, he aimed to bring the language back to the primal purity of its Anglo-Saxon roots, with poetry that was intended to be heard rather than read silently on the page. His studies at Oxford gave him a thorough grounding in Greek and Latin, history and philosophy, but his reading wasn't confined to the syllabus. He read, for example, Dickens' Our Mutual Friend in serialised form between May 1864 and December 1865. Over his lifetime, his letters demonstrate a breadth of reading, the authors are listed there, and a shrewd analysis of both past and contemporary literature. He also had a good knowledge of Italian, French, and Old English, and would later learn Welsh. He was clearly widely read, an autodidact, and intellectual. At Oxford, Hopkins was also exposed to some of the finest minds of his day. Benjamin Jowett, Master of Balliol in 1870, the one who would later christen Hopkins as the Star of Balliol, was a renowned classical scholar and regarded as one of the greatest teachers of the 19th century. Hopkins was tutored also by Walter Pater, on the right there, whose book, the Renaissance studies in art and poetry in 1877 became a manifesto for the aesthetic movement. Pater was an agnostic who believed that since death holds for us no hope, we must seize all of life that we can. Hopkins formed a lifetime friendship despite their conflict of belief. Pater's view of beauty as the only truth was opposed by Hopkins, but nevertheless informed his theology. With Pater, Hopkins shared interests in Dante, medievalism, and the Pre-Raphaelites, among whom Pater had friends. In July 1864, Hopkins would meet Holman Hunt and Christina Rossetti at a party, the latter a poet whose religious convictions and medievalism he greatly admired. Other guests at the party included the Brownings, Dante Rossetti, R.W. Dixon, and the Swedish opera singer Jenny Lind. Hopkins also made strong friendships among his peers and was a keen socialite. Perhaps the most important of these was Robert Bridges, whose exchange of letters from 1877 to his death would be the primary sounding board for his poetry. There were, however, others with whom Hopkins was happy to engage in lively debate and take with him on long, pleasurable walks into the Oxford countryside. They found him good fun. Hopkins' letters at this time suggest a buoyant and boisterous humour. Here are two friends with him on the left there on a walking holiday in Sussex. Hopkins is holding the pith helmet. In the summer of 1866, he had already spent a week's walking in the West Country with another Balliol friend, which included a visit to a Benedictine monastery at Belmont, where he spoke to a Benedictine priest, the first Catholic priest he'd ever spoken to. That was in Herefordshire. It could also be said that Hopkins had his heart broken at Oxford. He fell in love with a distant cousin of Bridges, an old Etonian from an aristocratic background called Digby Alban. This infatuation was, however, not reciprocated, and Alban, who had been expelled from Eton for wandering around the countryside dressed as a barefoot medieval monk, barely noticed him. Hopkins was racked with guilt over his homoerotic tendencies and would subject himself to severe physical penances because of it. His high church confessor, Canon Liddon, forbade further contact, and in fact, Hopkins had only met Alban in person once. Alban drowned in 1867, but by then their relationship had cooled and Hopkins' life had taken a different direction. Oxford in the 1860s was a hotbed of religious controversy. In 1845, John Henry Newman, an evangelical academic, Anglican priest, and key figure in the Oxford movement, had converted to Roman Catholicism. In the wake of industrialization and secularization, encouraged by the scientific rationalism of Huxley and Darwin, the Church of England divided into a number of factions. Anglo-Catholics led by Pusey and the Tractarians sought to move the Anglican Church closer to Rome in its celebration of the sacramental. They were lovers of beauty, particularly the medieval beauty of English Catholicism. In June 1864, Hopkins, then a follower of Pusey and Liddon, described Oxford as the head and fount of Catholicism in England and the heart of our church, by which he meant the Church of England. Opposed to the Anglo-Catholics was the Broad Church faction, which minimized dogma, tried to reconcile developments in modern thought with Christianity, and embraced the evangelical movements, which prioritized biblical teaching over church authority. For Newman, however, the rejection of papal authority was the stumbling block which had prevented him continuing in a church in which he was otherwise very much at home. In 1864, he published his account of his conversion to Rome and its justification in his Apologia pro vita sua, a defense of one's own life. It was a defense of its integrity following a scathing attack from the author and academic Charles Kingsley. On reading this, Hopkins was struck by its internal logic and began exploring the possibilities of his own conversion to Rome. Hopkins had always been excessively devout and taken his religion very seriously. His diaries began to record his sins and the penances and self-mortification he had embraced, particularly during Lent. So no lunch or meat on Fridays, not to sit in an armchair except can work in no other way, Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, bread and water. He craved for a religion that could speak with true authority, which made demands on its followers, and which offered the dogmatic certainty of an apostolic succession and transubstantiation, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Newman opened that door for him. As his journal entry for the 17th of July made clear, he resolved to say nothing to his family and friends until 3 months had passed, and was received into the church by John Henry Newman in Birmingham on October the 21st, and confirmed by Archbishop Manning in Bayswater on the 4th of November 1866. By then, he'd already for some time been attending the Roman Catholic Mass at Oxford's small Jesuit mission chapel of St. Ignatius. Breaking this news to his parents was as painful for him as it was for them. He wrote on the 16th of October a letter which seemed cold to his parents, and his austere father wrote a distraught reply on the 18th of October, which was evidence of their great love for each other and the pain of the religious divide which now separated them. His father wrote, "The manner in which you seem to repel and throw us off cuts us to the heart," to which his mother added a postscript, "Oh, Gerard, my darling boy, are you indeed gone from me?" There was a blizzard of recriminatory letters, but Hopkins had made up his mind, and there was no going back. When he had first decided to convert to Catholicism, Hopkins had written to Father Newman, as he was then, and visited him in Birmingham. Newman gave him fatherly advice about taking his time to decide and not to convert until he had taken his degree. Had they wanted to, the Oxford authorities could have made this difficult for him had he already become a Catholic. It was still not unknown, for example, for university proctors to send their bulldogs to stand at the door of the Church of St. Ignatius, taking the names of any student choosing to attend Mass there. After the rupture in relations with his family, he was invited to visit Newman at the Birmingham Oratory and offered a teaching post in the Oratory School. Hopkins lasted for 2 terms. It was while he was teaching the boys in the Oratory School that Hopkins decided not only to become a priest, but also to join the Jesuit order. The Jesuit order's severe code of obedience and the life of an ascetic suited Hopkins' personality and his perceived need to conquer himself. This had already led to the earlier acts of self-mortification practiced as an Oxford undergraduate and praised in his undergraduate poem, The Habit of Perfection. The Jesuits were founded by St. Ignatius Loyola, a Spanish soldier and nobleman who lived between 1491 and 1556. Wounded by a cannonball at the Battle of Pamplona, Ignatius underwent a spiritual conversion, and on the 25th of March 1522 began 11 months of asceticism, prayer and meditation while living in a cave in a place called Manresa in Catalonia. It was here that he devised his spiritual exercises, intended as the guiding principles of the religious missionary order he would found in 1540. As the name suggests, these exercises are a spiritual training, akin to the training of a soldier or an athlete. Thus, as well as taking vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, and a further vow of submission to follow the directions of the Pope, Jesuits honed their asceticism by deep meditation on the life, passion, and resurrection of Christ, and a continuous examination of conscience for the purgation of past sins. The intensity, self-abnegation, and surrender to the will of God by submission to the discipline of his superiors fitted Hopkins' temperament like a glove. The less severe Benedictines whom Hopkins had first thought of joining would not have suited him, as the shrewd Newman had observed. On the 5th of May 1868, Hopkins firmly resolved to be a religious. Less than a week later, he made a bonfire of his poems, something he described in his journal for the 11th of May as the slaughter of the innocents. For the next 7 years, his literary energies would be devoted to journals, sermons, and the writing of letters, all of which would have to be subject to inspection by his Jesuit superiors. Like a latter-day Savonarola, whom Hopkins admired, he embarked on an act of self-sacrifice and total dedication that was typical of the ascetic who had recorded in his journal less than 3 years earlier, "On this day, by God's grace, I resolved to give up all beauty until I had his leave for it," and who frequently practiced what he called the penance of the eyes. This involved keeping his eyes fixed on the ground as a means of repressing his passion for the nature that he loved and that was all around him. In 1869, this lasted for 6 months, from January to July. Thankfully for us, copies of many of his poems had already been shared with his friends and are therefore still with us today. The IHS monogram is, of course, the emblem of the Jesuits. On the 7th of September 1868, after a last chance visit to Switzerland, where Jesuits were banned, Hopkins began the first 2 years of his novitiate at Manley House, now part of the Roehampton University and overlooking Richmond Park. He would continue studying to become a Jesuit for the next 14 years. He was 24 years old. At the beginning of his novitiate, there was a silent retreat for 30 days, and then long hours of study and religious observances. In the Jesuit archive of Mount Street, Mayfair in London, is the Beadle's Journal, recorded in Hopkins' distinctive handwriting in 1869 with crossings out. A beadle, bidelos in Latin, or porter, was a student assigned the task of recording daily events, the mundane nature of which can be seen here: spiritual reading, benediction, meditation, and saying the rosary, for example. His job, perhaps more excitingly, was also to ring the bells. After taking his first vows of poverty and chastity, the next part of his novitiate between September 1870 and August 1873 was at St. Mary's Hall, the Spartan cemetery behind the impressive Tudor buildings you see here of Stonyhurst College. It's in Lancashire in the northwest of England. He was here to study philosophy, mathematics and logic for 3 years. It was an austere regime to which the scholastics, as they were called, were subjected. Even the ascetic Hopkins found it challenging at times. There were 2 hours of lectures in the morning, followed by religious observances, and a further 3 hours of study between 5 and 8 in the evening. Conversation was only permitted at meal times. Too frequently, he suffered from ill health, and in 1873 was forbidden to fast during Lent. This is not a decision that Hopkins or his superiors would have taken lightly. However, his letters to his mother during this time were both warm and good-humoured, even though he did describe Stonyhurst to her as dank as ditch water. His journals, though, are full of the beauty of the place. Here in Ribblesdale were hills, meadows, rivers and woodlands, and when he did have moments of recreation, he enjoyed communing with nature to the full. His fellow brothers might also regard him as a little eccentric, one describing him as a strange one, that Mr. Hopkins, on his hands and knees, looking at raindrops bouncing off the quartz pebbles and crying at how beautiful they were, and on another occasion enthusing over the patterns of the frozen water droplets in the urinals he was supposed to be cleaning. For Hopkins, though, the highlight of his philosophate years was the discovery of Duns Scotus, he who of all men most sways my spirits to peace, and of reality the rarest veined unraveller, as he is described in his poem Duns Scotus Oxford. John Duns Scotus was the medieval philosopher, a Franciscan and theologian who challenged the worldview postulated by Thomas Aquinas that it is undifferentiated universal qualities that define a human being. He advocated instead a world where uniqueness and individuality are to be celebrated as part of God's plan for mankind. If each individual person is unique, then each individual has a duty to fulfill that potential, that uniqueness that gives a person. St. Ignatius had also taught that the individual possessed 3 things: an intellect capable of knowing, a heart formed for loving, and a body endowed with beautiful senses. Hopkins discovered that his poetic imagination need not conflict with his Jesuit vocation after all. For Scotus, this idea of uniqueness applied not only to human beings, but to all of God's creation, a place, a living creature, an object, or a moment. The material world for Scotus was not divorced from God, but a witness to his presence in the world. For Hopkins had always been attuned to the beauty and uniqueness of creation. This was music to his ears. It was reflected in the detailed journals he kept, where he noted the world around him and sketched and composed music, journals which one critic has described as having the analytic power of a scientist, the shaping eye of an artist, and the power of expression of a poet. Here's an example of a record of different cloud formations. This discovery of Duns Scotus was an epiphany for Hopkins and would inform the concept of inscape, which is central to our understanding of his poetry. By inscape, Hopkins meant the inner quality of something, that which defines its uniqueness. It was a term which predated his discovery of Scotus, but which chimed with the worldview he discovered there. In the same way, a landscape or seascape is a unique whole made up of separate parts. So each of those parts has a uniqueness of its own. And for Hopkins, each of these objects was a manifestation of Christ in the world. Inscape, what Scotus called hexaity, or thisness, gave Hopkins a unifying theory for his love of nature and his vocation as a Jesuit. Thomism, the philosopher Thomas Aquinas, gave him an understanding of the unity of all things. But Scotism gave him the individuation he had seen all around him, as seen, for example, in these two journal entries about the bluebell. Hopkins found inscape everywhere. Again, I'll let you read these for yourself. By August 1873, Hopkins was back at Manresa House, this time as Professor of Rhetoric, teaching Greek and Latin to 11 young Jesuits who had completed their novitiate and would go on to do their philosophate once they had received some more academic training. The Jesuits could have employed him in one of their schools where he was needed, but chose what would have been a relatively cushy number where he could visit his parents and make use of his first-class education. As Professor of Rhetoric, he also taught literature, and his lecture notes from the time display a good grounding not only in Greek and Latin literature, but also Hebrew, Icelandic, Anglo-Saxon, Spanish, and French. Composing his extensive notes on prosody also gave him the opportunity to firm up his own ideas on the craft of poetry and develop his system of verse organized by counting stresses rather than syllables, the sprung rhythm that would become the hallmark of his best poetry. Innovation of meter, diction, and syntax is what is most characteristic of Hopkins' verse, and which made him such an inspiration for the later 20th century poets. For his final 3 years of study before ordination, this time known as the Theologate, with a focus on theology, Hopkins was sent to St. Bino's College in North Wales, a Gothic pile designed by the architect of the hansom cab. Though conditions could be frugal, decent outside and skimping within, as he described it, this was to be a period of great happiness, which led to an outpouring of poetic creativity. From the house at St. Bino's, Hopkins could look across the Vale of Clwyd towards the mountains of Snowdonia. His spirit was uplifted. He wrote on the 6th of September 1874, "A blue bloom, a sort of meal, seemed to have spread upon the distant south, enclosed by a basin of hills. Looking all around, but most in looking far up the valley, I felt an in-stress and a charm of Wales." In-stress here is a complementary concept to that of inscape. It refers both to the force that holds the unique pattern of an object together and the force which has an impact on the beholder and draws him in. Not only was he inspired by the Welsh landscape, he was also inspired to learn the Welsh language. And from this, he learnt the alliterative system of Welsh poetry, which is with its set patterns of consonants and internal rhyme, known as Cynhaned. which he would adapt for his own bravely idiosyncratic poetry. And after this encounter with Duns Scotus, his return to writing poetry was not far away. In 1868, Hopkins had vowed not to write any poetry without the express permission of his superiors. And apart from some occasional religious verses for special feast days that he'd been asked to write, he had kept to that vow. On Monday, the 6th of December, at 5 a.m., however, there occurred the event with which we began this talk. The emigrant ship, the Deutschland, sailing from Bremen to New York via Southampton, ran aground on the Goodwin Sands off the coast of Kent, and 57 people had drowned, about a third of the passengers and crew. Among these were 5 Franciscan nuns exiled from Germany under Bismarck's anti-Catholic Falk laws. The newspapers of the day were full of the story because the ship had foundered in a snowstorm despite a lapse of 24 hours and several passing ships that had not heeded the captain's calls for help. It was only on the next day, 30 hours later, that the 173 survivors of the wreck were rescued. When Hopkins was discussing this, his rector, Father James Jones, casually mentioned that it would be good if someone wrote a poem about it. This was the invitation Hopkins needed to write his most famous poem, The Wreck of the Deutschland. In 35 carefully structured stanzas of 8 lines each, it packed his experiments in diction, imagery, syntax, and sound effects, ideas about inscape and sprung rhythm, and his revitalized theology of God's presence in the world. In the end, it proved too complex for inclusion in the Jesuit magazine The Month, but it remains to this day his masterpiece. It's an ode, and not just a narrative poem, in which the poet, like Milton, sets out to justify the ways of God to man. The first 10 stanzas reflect on his own conversion, the next 25 on the shipwreck and its significance. Its title includes the dedication here to 5 Franciscan nuns drowned between midnight and morning on December the 7th, 1875. But you'll notice it's described as a happy memory, because for Hopkins, the bravery of these nuns was a means to the conversion not only of their fellow passengers, but also of England. So a taster of 2 stanzas only. This, by the way, is a stained glass window from the church of the Franciscan nuns in Pittsburgh. So the narrative element of the poem does not begin until the second half, and by stanza 17, the heroine of the poem emerges. She is the leader of the 5 Franciscan nuns who will bear witness to Christ's presence at the heart of the storm and to his saving mercy. They fought with God's cold, and they could not, and fell to the deck, crushed them, or water, and drowned them, or rolled with the sea romp over the wreck. Night roared with the heartbreak hearing, a heart-broke rabble, the woman's wailing, the crying of child without check, till a lioness arose, breasting the babel, a prophetess towered in the tumult, a virginal tongue told. And then the final stanza, as the poem reaches a climax, it's in the form of a prayer as the nun, now in heaven, is asked to intercede on behalf of his country and bring others back to Christ by her example of faith. She becomes a human metaphor for all suffering and salvation, as well as a metaphor for Hopkins' own spiritual journey. Dame at our door, drowned and among our shoals, remember us in the roads, the heaven haven of the reward. Our king back, oh, upon English souls, let him Easter in us, be a dayspring to the dimness of us, be a crimson crested east, more brightening her rare dear Britain as his reign rolls. Pride, rose, prince, hero of us, high priest, our hearts charity's heart's fire, our thoughts chivalry's throngs lord. Now, you may find the theology controversial. His was, after all, a counter-Reformation order committed to the reconversion of England, and the poem's layers of meaning not always immediately accessible. But there's no doubting the power of Hopkins' poetic imagination or the beauty of his sprung rhythm, sound effects, and imagery. It's poetry to be heard as much as read, as Hopkins often insisted. Once started, Hopkins set out on his most creative poetic period. There were only 3 poems in 1876, the next year, but the following year, He wrote his most musical and joyous poetry, as illustrated by the opening and closing lines of "As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame," shown here, and that lovely ending, "Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces." One of his 11 best sonnets, all written in 1877. Of the 48 mature poems he completed in his lifetime, 34 were sonnets. Another of these sonnets is Pied Beauty. The sonnets are listed there. And I'll read this one as well. Hopkins saw the poet's role as to identify and celebrate the beauty of God's created world at a time when pied things were viewed as the antithesis of beauty. It has a simplicity and dignity and draws attention to the individuality, the inscape of pied objects. Note the experimental form, by the way. I know you can all count. So a sonnet is 14 lines. This has 10 lines rather than the usual 14, and so is known as a curtal sonnet, but retains the same balance. And it goes like this. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple colour as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire-cold chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pierced, fold, fallow and plough, and old trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth his beauty is past change. Praise him. 1877 would be a very busy one for Hopkins. At the end of July, he took a theology exam and was ordained for the priesthood on the 23rd of September at St. Bino's College. It was anticipated that he would then begin his fourth and final year of theology at St. Bino's. Yet to everybody's surprise, the Star of Balliol had learnt on August the 9th that he, who had never failed an exam in his life, had achieved only average marks in his final theology exam. Scholars are still bemused as to why Hopkins superiors, why Hopkins accepted it with, scholars are still bemused as to why. Hopkins accepted it with the stoicism and the submission to the will of his superiors that he had practiced since joining the Jesuits 9 years earlier. There was some disappointment at leaving a place where he had found friendship, inspiration and happiness, and regret that he would never be able to progress up the ranks and one day become provincial of the order. It did mean, though, that he would now have to take up the practical duties of a Jesuit priest. He began as an administrator assistant, priest and temporary teacher at Mount St. Mary's College near Sheffield, on the top there, between October and the following April, before returning to Stonyhurst between May and June of 1878 to coach senior pupils in classics in preparation for starting their degree courses. He had begun writing letters in earnest to Robert Bridges in April 1877 and to his former teacher, now Canon Richard Watson Dixon, in May 1878. It was thanks to this that so many of his poems and his thinking behind them have been preserved for posterity. In July 1878, he became a temporary curate at the Jesuit Church in Mount Street, Mayfair, before returning on the 21st of November 1878, for a week's curacy in Bristol, to his beloved Oxford. Towery city and branchy between towers, cuckoo echoing, bells swarmed, lark charmed, rook racked, river rounded, as he described it in his poem Duns Scotus Oxford. He would again enjoy long walks in the countryside as he had when a student, and be pained whenever he witnessed man's destruction of the natural world, so that aftercomers cannot guess the beauty been, as he wrote the following March in his poem Bincy Poplars. While at Oxford, he was the founder of the Newman Society for Catholic members of the university, assisted in the church in the parish of St. Aloysius Gonzaga, newly completed in 1875. Oscar Wilde was there at the laying of its foundation stone, by the way. But Aloysius Gonzaga was always upstage still in its ritual by the Anglican St. Barnabas Church. Hopkins was also a chaplain to the infantry division at Cowley Barracks, which gave rise to another of his famous poems, The Bugler's First Communion. When he sent this poem to Bridges, he made the, to us, rather shocking observation that I'm half inclined to hope that the hero of it may be killed in Afghanistan. But this must be understood in the context of a sincere religious dogmatism, whereby dying in a state of grace, the young boy had just received his first communion, was a direct passport to heaven. Hopkins was devout, unstinting, and well-intentioned in everything he did, but had a personal awkwardness of manner. This gave him an affinity with the young, but didn't always stand him in good stead with the older members of his parish. That awkwardness of manner would be severely tested when he had to leave Oxford to minister among the poor of the industrial north of England and Glasgow. In October 1879, Hopkins was posted north to the industrial town of Lee, near Manchester, as curate in the Church of St. Joseph's for 3 months. The ravages of industrialisation had taken their toll on these northern towns, and the nature-loving southerner found it very gloomy. The houses red, mean and two-storied. There are a dozen mills or so, and coal pits also, the air charged with smoke as well as damp, he wrote. Despite this, during his 3 months in Lee, he found the Lancashire people to be hearty. He was less impressed with the people of the Liverpool slums, many of whom were poor Irish immigrants, when he was transferred to the Church of St. Francis Xavier in Everton in December of that same year. He would be there for nearly 2 difficult years until August 1881. Whether through his own awkwardness and failure to engage, his sermons were ill-suited to his congregation, and he seems to have little sympathy for those who would bury their sorrows in drink or spit on the pavement in front of him. It was not a fulfilling time for him. Writing to Bridges on the 26th of October 1880 about the ugliness of the city with its polluted river, he confided, "One is so fagged, so harried and galled up and down, and the drunkards go on drinking. The filthy, as the scripture says, are filthy still." There's a contradiction here between his awareness of the sordid industrial conditions under which people lived and the injustices they were subjected to, and his rejection of a political solution. He did say in a letter to Bridges from Stonyhurst that, in a manner, I'm a communist, but prefaced it with "horrible to say." This, though, was this condemnation of gross inequality was enough for Bridges. It was too revolutionary for him, and as a consequence, Bridges rejected his red letter and refused to write to him for 2.5 years. Yet in a later letter, Hopkins himself spoke disparagingly of loafers, tramps, corner boys, roughs, socialists, and other pests of society. The young curate could be vehement towards his flock, and this was hardly going to endear him to them. However, what little he did write in Liverpool, what he described of all places the most museless, does show him in a more positive light. His admiration and sympathy for the Liverpool farrier dying of pulmonary tuberculosis in his poem Felix Randall, "A man big-boned and hardy handsome, sickness broke him," shows a genuine warmth for one of his parishioners. And another much anthologized poem, Spring and Fall, again shows a sympathy with the young he found it difficult to feel for their parents. This is addressed to a young child called Margaret, who weeps at the first leaf fall, which for Hopkins is a reminder of man's expulsion from the Garden of Eden and the transience of mortality. It's a sad and sentimental poem, but one which shows a great sympathy for the child's loss of innocence. It's also always reminded me of how some children brought up in poverty have to grow up much too quickly. It begins with the lines, "Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove and leaving?" before reminding us that, as the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder. His next posting was to St. Joseph's Church in the slums of Glasgow, a wretched place, according to Hopkins. He was there as a temporary parish priest for 3 months between August and October 1881. He found the Clyde to be as polluted as the Irwell or the Mersey. Yet again he came away with a conviction, a truly crushing conviction, he said, of the misery of town life, of the degradation even of our race, of the hollowness of this century's civilization. Yet his experience was arguably more positive. He described the poor Irish of Glasgow, though always very drunken and at present very Fenian, they are warm-hearted and give a far heartier welcome than those at Liverpool. In Liverpool, he complained that he never saw the sun or left the city. But from Glasgow, at the end of his time there, he is able very briefly to visit Loch Lomond. He wrote to Bridges in September 1881 of a pensive or solemn beauty which left a deep impression on me. It was this that inspired him to compose one very beautiful soundscape poem after a year when the muse had for the most part left him. It's called Inversnaid, after the place on Loch Lomond, and contains the use of Scottish dialect in lines such as wiry heath parks flutch as fun, and the bead bonny ash that sits over the bun, and a plea for wild nature to be left alone, which is still as relevant today. What would the world be once bereft of wet and of wilderness, of wildness? Let them be left. I'm going to do that again. What would the world be once bereft of wet and of wildness? Let them be left. Oh, let them be left, wildness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. It seems that his spiritual batteries had been recharged. In October 1881, he returned to Roehampton for a third time. After the baptism of fire he had endured in parish work, for which he was in many ways unsuited, his return to Roehampton must have come as something of a relief. It has to be said that despite his many qualities as a human being, he wasn't a particularly good preacher or teacher, and he found the demands of an inner city curate exhausting and at times depressing. He had now returned to Manresa House. 14 years after enrolling as a novice in the Jesuit order, he was now ready for his tertianship, a period of study, prayer, and physical work leading to the taking of his final vows. It began with a silent retreat and period of exclusion. I see no newspapers and read none but spiritual books. Like the novices, they undertook manual work in the park and on the farm and were sent to parishes to help with priestly duties. This meant, for example, that Hopkins travelled to Preston to help at a church there during Lent and led a retreat at Maryport in Cumbria, which enabled him to meet with Canon R.W. Dixon in Carlisle and see him for the last time. By the 15th of August 1882, he was ready to take his final vows as a Jesuit and to sign the mandatory last will and testament shown here on the right, in which everything at his death would be bequeathed to the society. His vow of poverty was complete. For the next 17 months, Hopkins was back teaching at Stonyhurst, his third time there. He was employed teaching Latin, Greek, and some English to a group of rich and not very well motivated young men who had stayed for an extra year to prepare for university. Again, he wasn't a very successful teacher and was very often overcome with weariness. He had written no poetry during his tertianship at Roehampton and very little at Stonyhurst. He did, however, meet the poet Coventry Patmore, pictured there, he of the Angel in the House fame, and began a lengthy correspondence with him, the third poet with whom he could discuss his work. It was while Hopkins was teaching at Stonyhurst that an event of global significance occurred. On the 20th of May 1883, the Indonesian island of Krakatoa exploded, and thus began one of the deadliest and most destructive volcanic events in recorded history. His account, written with the scientific and artistic eye for God's creation, was published in Nature on the 3rd of January 1884 under the heading Remarkable Sunsets. This is an extract from the article he wrote. I'll let you read it. It was ironical that while none of his poetry was ever published in his lifetime, this remarkable poetic and scientifically astute account was. A month later, Hopkins would have his final posting as a Jesuit priest. University College Dublin had been founded by Newman as a rival to the Protestant-run Trinity College and had been taken over by the Jesuits in 1883. Here is Hopkins arrowed along with his fellow Jesuits. Of the 7 Jesuit professors in English universities, Hopkins was the only one whom the English province was willing to spare. Therein lies the tale, I think. The post would seem to have been one that suited Hopkins' academic background, but it proved to be yet another cross he had to bear. His duties as a lecturer in Greek and Latin and an examiner of the same were onerous, and conscientious to a fault, he was soon worn down by his new responsibilities. He wrote to Bridges on the 7th of March 1884 about the 6 examinations I've yearly to conduct, both set and marked, and the 750 candidates for whom he was responsible. He excused himself of replying to Dixon on another occasion because he still had 537 examination papers to mark. A state of drudgery which any teacher out there will sympathise with, no doubt. Worse still, he had left the familiarity and stability of Stonyhurst, where he felt at home, for a place where he would feel, even with the friendships he made, very much an outsider. His growing sense of alienation and exhaustion led to what are known as the terrible sonnets, or sonnets of desolation, which make up a significant proportion of his poetic output in his final years. While it's true that the spiritual exercises involved the active use of the imagination, and that the most terror-inducing moments can be attributed to a self-induced exploration of the dark night of the soul, there's also no doubt that Hopkins underwent a period of depression, alone, isolated, overworked, physically broken, and feeling at times that his prayers were unanswered. As he said in one poem, cries countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him that lives, alas, away. The terrible sonnets of 1885 are listed here, with the opening of To Seem a Stranger. And here is I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. An opening line itself, all the more terrifying when you consider that the word fell carries connotations not only of a vast expanse of moorland, but also the skin of a wild animal. The sestet contains the lines, I am gall, I am heartburn, God's most deep decree. Bitter would have me taste, my taste was me. Bones built in me, flesh filled, blood brimmed, the curse, self yeast of spirit, a dull dough sours. He felt at times abandoned by his God and spiritually emaciated, time's eunuch, as he described himself in another poem. There were brief respites from his duties as a teacher and examiner. A holiday in his beloved Wales and another in Lochaber, climbing Ben Nevis and the mountains of Glencoe, for example, and the time staying with some of the wealthy Anglo-Irish Catholic families of Dublin and Kildare. And there was also an occasion in November 1886 when a fellow Jesuit took him to the nearby studio of the artist John Butler Yeats, where he met his soon-to-be famous son William, at the time a shy, introspective youth of 21, and another poet, Kate Tynan. Neither Yeats nor Hopkins seemed impressed with the other. Politically also, they were incompatible. Hopkins was ever the English patriot, while Yeats was already emerging as a voice of young Ireland. At a time of great nationalist fervour, Hopkins was alone among his fellow Jesuits and students in opposing Home Rule, at least at first. Though he mellowed in this, he did continue to believe the deluded suggestion that Charles Stewart Parnell had been complicit in the Phoenix Park murders. It was yet again a reason for his sense of being an outsider. Yet Hopkins seems to have come through with courage and resilience. In his poem, That Nature is a Heraclitean Fire, written on the 26th of July, 1888, we see again the celebration of nature's beauty and the poetic creativity of newly coined words like shive light and shadow tackle to describe the ever-changing patterns on the woodland floor. And then the restoration of hope in the moment of revelation which ends the poem. In a flash, At a trumpet crash, I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am. And this Jack, Joke, poor Potsherd, Patch, Matchwood, immortal Diamond is immortal Diamond. By the following year, Hopkins' health had deteriorated. His last poem was appropriately addressed to Robert Bridges and written on the 22nd of April, 1889. It ends with a note of regret at the loss of poetical inspiration, ironically, because it's a very good poem. It ends, or it begins with, it ends with, oh, then if in my lagging lines you miss the roll, the rise, the carol, the creation, my winter world that scarcely breathes that bliss now yields you with some sighs our explanation. 8 weeks later, on the 8th of June, 1889, he was dead. He was already feeling unwell in April, and on the 8th of May, he wrote to his mother to say that he had been diagnosed with a sort of typhoid. Sanitation was in an appalling state in his lodgings, but not severe enough, he said, to be worrying. In retrospect, it seems that he was also suffering from Crohn's disease, not given a name until 1932, and peritonitis. By the end of May, his condition had worsened. He had now been long reconciled to his parents, who came over to Dublin to be with him in his final days and were there at his bedside when he died. According to the priest who had visited him earlier in the day, his final whispered words were, "I am so happy," repeated over and over again. He was buried in the common Jesuit plot at Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin. His name on the shared memorial is among many others and gives his title, name and age in Latin. He was 44 years old. And there he might have lain, a forgotten poet, had it not been for his critical friend and confidant, Robert Bridges. In 1913, at the age of 69, Bridges had become poet laureate and decided to publish a selection of Hopkins' poems in 750 copies. He included the Wreck of the Deutschland, but unlike Dixon, he was never enthusiastic about it. He described it as the great dragon folded at the gate to forbid all entrance to Hopkins' poetry. The volume did not sell well, was dismissed by Eliot and Yeats, and only really came into its own for the poets in the 1930s, and after that, especially Robert Lowell and Seamus Heaney. In 1923, however, Virginia Woolf had visited the poet laureate Bridges with Aldous Huxley and had pointedly asked to see Hopkins' poems rather than those of her host. In 1975, a memorial stone was laid in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey between those of Eliot and Auden, under the Jesuit motto, Ad Maiorem Dei Gratia, to the greater glory of God. And so, this then was the man, the poet, and the Jesuit. He was small and slightly built at 5'4". He suffered from persistent health problems and often complained of exhaustion. He was generally a poor preacher and teacher who was often unable to pitch his esoteric learning to the level of his audience and carried with him a personal awkwardness and shyness. In Liverpool, he had blotted his copybook by professing his conservative politics. He had always despised Gladstone. In Stonyhurst, by the reputation he gained for eccentricity. He once rescued a monkey from a precarious position on the roof. And in Dublin, where he would never lecture about anything that might be in the examination in case it might give an unfair advantage to his students. You can imagine how his classes reacted after learning that. His English patriotism and suspicion of nationalism did not endear him to his students either. He combined some reactionary and imperialistic views with genuine compassion for those who were suffering. He could have moments of deep depression followed by high elation, positivity, and good humour. Throughout his life, he always loved punning, was a born mimic, and was once discovered blowing pepper through a keyhole in order to disrupt a meeting by making the occupants sneeze. He was in many ways a flawed human being who could be dogmatic, headstrong, and uncompromising in his beliefs. But he did not hold the disbelief of his friends against them, despite being frighteningly devout in his own life. He also showed a deep humility and personal courage, a man of great sincerity, popular with his fellows. A contemporary Jesuit who had known him at St. Bino's said of him, "What struck me most of all in him was his childlike guilelessness and simplicity, his gentleness, his tender-heartedness, and his loving compassion for the young, the weak, the poor, and for all who are in any trouble or distress." And for his contribution to English literature, few could argue against the suggestion that he was, as the epithet on his memorial plaque in Westminster Abbey describes him, an immortal diamond. If you've not had enough of Hopkins already, you may want to read about his life, either from a psychological perspective in Robert Burnham Martin's Gerard Manley Hopkins, A Very Private Life, or the sympathetic, insightful, and beautifully written account by the American Paul Mariani, which is shown here. Should you wish to find out more about Hopkins, you can always become a Jesuit, or failing that, visit Stonyhurst with the Hopkins Society, or travel to Newbridge, County Kildare, where there's an annual Hopkins Festival. Monstravan, nearby, where this memorial is located, was where he had many happy hours with the Cassidy family. Or you could travel to Hazelmere in Surrey, to the Anglican Church of St. Bartholomew's, to see the stained glass window that Hopkins' parents funded. They had moved to Courts Hill Lodge there from Hampstead in June 1886. Or you could travel to the United Nations Palace of Nations, a building on the shores of Lake Geneva, where in the entrance hall, beneath an Eric Gill relief, are the powerful opening words from the wreck of the Deutschland, inscribed: "Thou mastering me, God, giver of breath and bread, whirl strand, sway of the sea, Lord of living and dead. Over again, I feel thy finger and find thee." But the best way to appreciate Hopkins is, of course, to read his poetry. It's not always immediately accessible, but like Hopkins in another context, again, the wreck of the Deutschland, we can say, "For I greet him the days I meet him, and bless when I understand." I would just like to end, though, with what I think is his finest sonnet, and the one that Hopkins himself always regarded as his best. Written on Wednesday, the 30th of May, 1877, at St. Bino's, it's a poem which speaks to those of any religion and none, and which combines the power of a sprung rhythm, powerful imagery, and sound effects with his theories of inscape and in-stress. It's called The Windhover. There's much that could be said about it, but given the limitations of time, I'll leave it with you and let it work its magic. A minion, by the way, is a darling or favourite. Cillian at the end is the shining earth revealed by the plough, or maybe the sheen of the plough itself. A windhover is an ancient name for a kestrel. A windhover to Christ our Lord. I caught this morning morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dappled dawn drawn falcon in his riding of the rolling level. Underneath him steady air and striding, high there, how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy, then off forth on swing, as a skate's heel sweeps smooth on a bow bend. The hurl and gliding rebuffed the big wind. My heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achieve of, the mastery of the thing. Brute beauty and valour and act, oh air, pride, plume, here buckle, and the fire that breaks from thee, then a billion times lovelier, more dangerous, O my chevalier. No wonder of it, sheer plod makes plough down Cillian shine, and blue bleak embers, ah, my dear, fall, gall themselves, and gash gold vermilion. So, thank you for listening.